In the morning, Violet found the Sentinel had fully invaded the camp without even showing up. She was the only topic of conversation. The soldiers rehashed the few details they knew and brewed them with their fears and speculation. It created an omnipresent dread that suited her mood nicely. She watched pairs of sleepless red eyes stray compulsively to the periphery of the camp, watching for any hint of rainbow movement. And everyone wore their sidearms, cleaned and oiled with the same care skydivers use in folding their parachutes. The colonel had gathered a few soldiers he was calling elite to do reconnaissance. She knew them all as above average. As they set out, she gave them a nod for luck, but could practically hear their bones breaking. Her bedraggled unit had no chance of producing a group of soldiers capable of standing up to any Sentinel. But it was war. Sending soldiers on hopeless missions was how war worked, even when any 10-year-old could see it was a bad idea. By evening, they'd returned with broken weapons and broken arms, doubly disarmed to Violet's mild, if inappropriate, amusement, but in better shape than the Rabbit Squad had been. She recognized the gentler approach as a classic Sentinel pattern. Make a powerful first impression, then inflict only the damage needed to achieve a goal. For no reason she understood, the news of her crook-armed comrade's otherwise safe return poked a memory of the Sentinel stepping between her and the slack-jawed soldier's weapon trained on her eye. Her creepy, glowing white back had been near enough to touch. Violet's cheeks flushed. How had she not seen what that meant? The Sentinel had turned her back on her when she was at her most desperate and vulnerable, when she'd have done anything to either live or take them all with her. She didn't consider Violet a threat. The soldier about to shoot her knew better, as did every soldier in that convoy. But the Sentinel had complete trust in her superiority to the lying little girl wearing chicken blood and barrettes. Whenever Violet went hunting, most of the work went into going unnoticed by her prey. She had to either stay downwind, silent and out of sight, or convince them she was harmless. And here the Sentinel's ego had done all that work for her. It was like a sign from the gods of war themselves. The camp's greatest enemy didn't consider the camp's greatest hunter a threat. At that moment, Violet understood it would be up to her to end the Sentinel. When she'd set out on her first bear hunt, it was no casual whim of an almost 9-year-old. Underestimating your enemy was a sure way to end up dead. She'd studied her adversary. When she'd trudged into the woods of early spring, the bears just awakening and ravenous from hibernation, she'd already made herself the most knowledgeable bear expert in 100 miles. She'd read every scrap she could find about the deadly man-eaters, interviewed everyone she could find with a history of bear encounters, and spent all the time she could spare in the woods tracking and observing them. That was how she would prepare to hunt the Sentinel. Their camp, being a former high school, had a fairly decent, largely intact library. There were plenty of books and magazines focused on Sentinels, some just a year old. A white-as-a-light-bulb, mute weirdo Sentinel who used a scarf as a weapon should have grabbed headlines and inspired stories in every magazine from People to Scientific American. And while she always read the most recent Sentinel news she could find, she'd never seen a hint of her. "At least we know you're new," she said out loud as she assessed her library's stacks. While there would be no reports of her camp's specific nemesis, there were plenty of paths available to deeper understanding. There was a book exploring countermeasures historically effective against various power sets. The Journal of Science had a study of powers that often occurred in tandem. Speed, she learned, often came with some level of invulnerability to heat. Late in the afternoon of her third deep dive into the library, she came across a story of an exiled Chinese scientist. He was working to replicate the powers of a 1930s Sentinel. Speeding Artful Cloud. She'd never heard of him, but the power set was more than similar to her Sentinels. The scientist in question had broken ethical boundaries a little too publicly, lost his position, and had since disappeared. Maybe he'd continued his work locally, she thought. Not that it mattered much. Apart from her library work, she talked with other soldiers about their thoughts and experiences with Sentinels. Most had nothing beyond anecdotes, but Corporal Agnes Roshenko had more insight. Agnes was one of the women of the unit who still had living children. Her sister had smuggled them across 2 borders, and now they lived in Paris. With Agnes missing her children, and Violet with no mother, the collective heart of the unit gently pressed them into one another's company. Their own hearts were not so eager. Each, in the presence of the other, became more aware of the holes in their lives. Yet, through some odd alchemy of shared grief, they formed a bond that left them strangers almost always, but nearly family the rest of the time. Violet found Agnes hanging out laundry, trying her best to make it look like a task that demanded anyone's full attention. It looked like a good way to avoid the only conversation the rest of the camp was having. She caught the woman's eye on approach and forced a nodded hello on her. Agnes's shoulders showed a little tension as Violet stopped next to her and waited in silence through the hanging of a wet shirt. Agnes reached for another shirt from her laundry bag, but social niceties demanded she at least glance Violet's way. She didn't have to ask what she needed, but she did have to pause and give her room to say whatever she'd come to say. When Violet asked, "Have you ever seen a sentinel?" she watched the woman's inner struggle play out on her face, mostly in her eyebrows. She wanted to be left alone, but children didn't start a conversation with an adult to vent frustration or share conspiracy theories. They had to screw up some courage to speak. Violet waded through Agnes's internal deliberation with her own performance of earnest patience. Finally, the woman sighed and said, "Well, I have a cousin. I'll spare you his name, but he's powered and not one of the good ones, I'm afraid. But it took them a long time to get him." "What'd he do?" Violet said, keeping her voice low, making sure to sound tentative. "Robbed banks, jewelry stores, whatever places have money," Agnes said and shook her head. "He had some mental problems. Has. When we were kids, he was never quite right. Loved animals, but was always just, off." Violet nodded a little, showing interest, but reining in any display of true thirst. "But what were his powers?" she said as she first looked at a pebble, then kicked it. Agnes let out a long huff, either disapproving of the question or the answer. Violet couldn't be sure which, so she waited. And as Agnes hung a pillowcase, she was rewarded. "Well," Agnes said, "he could walk through walls, turned into sort of a ghost. And if he touches you like that, it's like a lightning bolt. He did fight some of the big names." "Electric Pete?" Violet broke her traumatized little girl cover. Agnes looked at her like she was peering over the rims of lowered glasses, despite not wearing any. "Your cousin is Electric Pete? He's like huge." She didn't bother to hide her excitement. Better to lean into it and let it look childish. She could be annoyed with herself for breaking character later. "It's nothing to be proud of, Violet. He went to jail and they won't let him out anytime soon." The trace of maternal warmth in Agnes's voice was replaced with maternal rebuke. Violet stayed quiet for a count of 5. It gave Agnes time to cool down, and it made it look like she felt properly chastised. Also, blurted questions were too easy to deflect. When she spoke, she made sure to bring just a hint of childish fear into her voice. Adults knew every kid was afraid underneath whatever else was happening. When the fear hit the surface, they never questioned a kid's motives. "You think you'd have some ideas about how to beat the enemy sentinel?" Before Agnes spoke, she took a stab at a smile that didn't work out very well. "I've thought about that a lot," she said. "When he was first caught, they used to let family video chat. I called him most weeks, felt bad for him. I didn't like talking about what he did, but he did, so I just kind of half-listened. He never really hurt anyone. But, well, as far as our quick little arm breaker goes, he said the best way to stop a speedster is to sit still." Violet nodded. Then Agnes said, "Didn't work for him, though. Photon put him in prison." She punctuated the revelation with a raised eyebrow and a sassy head tilt. Violet shrugged and directed her eyes downward, not quite letting go of her fear act yet. Maybe he didn't sit still. Agnes chuckled, leaned a little to get closer to Violet's line of sight, and said, "Maybe. But listen, Violet. I don't know what's going to happen. No one does. But if this powered person is a sentinel, she won't hurt you." The sentinel struck every day after that, sometimes twice. No killing, but she did critical damage to the infrastructure of war, breaking supply lines and lines of communication. The disarming continued as well. Any patrol beyond the camp's limits and a good number of the outer perimeter guards were soon without rifles and unable to wipe themselves in the latrine. Eventually, Colonel Novak announced that Army intelligence had identified their nemesis as Sunshower, a relatively local sentinel who first appeared in civilian settings just a few months prior. Her power set was not well understood beyond being strong, quick, and possibly difficult to physically touch due to some factor independent of her speed. Field cameras captured plenty of video of the newly identified Sunshower's escapades. She left them untouched even when she took out everything around them. Violet recognized the deliberate choice to be filmed as another Sentinel strategy. Command gathered to review surveillance videos in the mess hall most afternoons. With so many disabled soldiers, Violet and her unbroken arms helped in the kitchen most days. She watched them play the videos, pausing to analyze this or that as she worked. At the highest frame rate the cameras could record, Sunshower's targets appeared to stand still as she flipped between them as easily as Violet walked across the room. She recognized every terrified face. They were all out there in part for her. Yes, she was a soldier, but she understood her never-spoken-out-loud role as the unit's collectively adopted daughter. Most had given up on protecting her from war's realities, but they tried not to swear in front of her, and she knew every one of them would die to protect her life. She wished she could call them off the hunt, bring every one of them back to the safety of the camp. The Sentinel wouldn't hurt her. She knew long before Agnes's thoughtful reassurance. She knew even as Sunshower sliced through the rabbit squad. The scent of the breeze in her wake told her so. In a matter of a few days, the unit had been left a limping, moaning mess. Yet, other than the run-ins with Sunshower, no further enemy attacks came. No one had seen so much as a single enemy scout, but food supplies dwindled. While no one was enthusiastic about it, they allowed Violet to take to the woods to supplement what little they had for the kitchen. While she'd heard stories of units having to eat their dead, Violet was much more concerned Command would decide they had to eat the camp's dogs. She started a line of traps and set up tree stands to hunt deer and whatever else might come by. The other soldiers would have returned with no rifle and no way to shoot one, but Sunshower, as they'd hoped, let Violet be. Her skill kept the unit fed, if a bit constipated with a mostly meat diet. She enjoyed the quiet walk to the day's hunting site. A sled for game pulled behind her as she checked her traps. But sometimes a forest sound sent her heart racing. What would she do if she encountered Sunshower like this? Run? That was nonsense, as was trying to shoot her. She remembered the Sentinel's back, looking like bare, blinding white skin stretched over steel-hard muscle. It was just inches away. She could have touched it. Completely against her own will, the thought calmed her. She winced and spit in the snow like she'd eaten a bug. Sunshower was the reason she had to hunt to keep the dogs safe. Then, her out-of-control brain had the gall to suggest if she got close to the Sentinel again, close enough to talk, maybe she could explain that her unit was the good guys. She could tell her all the things she'd seen the enemy do, and all the things the enemy made them do. A Sentinel should side with them, right? She could be her and her unit's protector. When she was about 5, her mother taught her to imagine rooms in her mind. If she had bad thoughts, or saw things she needed to forget, she could lock them away there. So Violet stopped in her tracks and closed her eyes. She constructed a vision of a stone room and a steel door as thick as a bank vault. Then, with a sneer on her close-eyed face, she took her unwelcome systemic fantasy by the scruff of its hypothetical neck, shoved it into the darkness, and slammed the door. Her mother had been helping her manage the evils of war, but she'd found it worked even better on stupid thoughts of impossible things. A few days later, the Sentinel far from her thoughts, Violet climbed into her tree stand and waited for sunrise to bring the deer out in the clearing below. A distinctly un-deer-like motion in the dead grass at the edge of the trees 100 meters distant drew her hunter's eye. Before she even set her sight fully on them, she knew what she would see. A small squad of soot-blackened soldiers crept low and silent. She couldn't pick out many details. It was just light enough to make her night scope less useful, and a little too dark for a day view. But she could see 7 of them. She squinted through her scope with increasingly deadly intent as her mind asked questions rapid-fire. Was she seeing all of them? Which one needed to go down first? Was she too high to jump from the tree and run? In far less than a second, she decided it didn't matter if she'd not seen all of them. The one with the pack needed to go first, and she jumped from higher. If she got hurt, she at least had her emergency grenade, so she could take a few, maybe even all of them with her when they got close. Besides, if she did this perfectly, she would take all 7 before they took her. Her finger squeezed the trigger. No shot fired. The trigger felt oddly blocked as something tickled her cheek like a breath. It was a breath. Suppressing a flinch, she turned her head, moving slowly and deliberately, like she'd crossed the path of a bear. There was the blank face of Sunshower, a few centimeters from hers. The Sentinel's powerful, delicate finger had snaked in just behind her trigger, preventing the shot. It struck Violet as a declaration. "You have lost," it said. She moved her hand onto her grenade, though she hoped to wait until the soldiers joined them to pull the pin. She'd modified it to detonate immediately after releasing the lever. It was her best assurance for a quick exit. She'd seen enough to know soldiers, especially soldiers like her, needed the option available. Sunshower brought her other index finger to where her lips would be, in a universal sign of shush. She still smelled like earth, sweat, and flowers. Violet withdrew her hand from her grenade. The breeze that followed Sunshower as she flashed out of the tree was warm, especially against Violet's winter-cold cheeks. She watched the dangerous rainbow cut through the field like a shark, gliding toward the soldiers in the mild light of dawn. In less than a minute, none of the crack stealth team was up to the task of soldiering, and their weapons were in pieces. In a few more seconds, Sunshower had returned to the tree. With the caring confidence of an adult taking charge of a child, she gently took Violet's weapon from her hands and hung it from the broken stump of a branch. Violet remained still, struggling to study her prey as, in her mind, locked-up thoughts pounded cell doors demanding release. It was like trying to remember details in a dream. She saw how Sunshower squatted comfortably on a too-thin branch that hung low and wobbled under her weight. The Sentinel didn't even have to put an arm on the tree to steady herself, and her face seemed almost visible, like if she tried harder, she'd see through the white expanse that covered it at least a little. Sunshower brought a knuckle to her chin, assessing the child soldier maybe, or considering her fate. There was a shift in her posture that might have been to keep her balance on the tiny branch. Violet felt a little flip of excitement in her belly, thinking she was about to reach out, maybe even touch her. Jumbled thoughts fought to use her voice. "Take me with you," or maybe, "Please stay." It might have been, "I'm going to kill you." The words refused to sort themselves out, so she reached out herself. The strong hand met hers halfway, gave it a gentle squeeze, then returned it to her unbroken. The whiteness that seamlessly covered its surface felt like skin, only hotter. Then, Sunshower slipped up the tree like she was falling in reverse, and dashed off through the branches, leaping to the next tree and the next, without a hint of effort. Violet stayed crouched on her perch. Deer ambled into the frozen field in full view, but her rifle remained where Sunshower had hung it. A breeze rattled the stiff winter grass and sent the cold, bare tree limbs clicking against each other. Slowly, jaw a little slack, eyes glassy, her face stiffened. Her lips quivered and then came together in a tight line. Her eyes squeezed shut. The muscles in her cheeks and around her mouth began to ache, and like an overloaded levee, her face first bulged, then burst as she let out a howl of pain and fury. The deer scattered in panic. Her tears and snot flowed and froze as she wrapped her arms around the thick, cold tree trunk like a motherless child seeking comfort, which was exactly what she was.